Primary sources and secondary sources. This presentation will explain the difference between a primary and a secondary source featuring examples from the first English colony in America, Jamestown. Walter C. Parker defines a primary source as materials created, written, spoken, filmed, painted, etc. during the time of study. Primary sources are eyewitness accounts detailing an event in history. For a source to truly be a primary source, the person writing, speaking, being filmed, being painted, etc., must have been present during the event. This map was created by Captain John Smith in 1624. It is considered a primary source because it was created during the time when Jamestown was founded. This is an illustration from Captain John Smith's The General History of Virginia, another primary source. Walter C. Parker describes secondary sources as interpretations of primary sources and artifacts. Secondary sources are any source that has been created after an event has already taken place and the period or event has already passed. Examples of secondary sources are the following: history textbooks, books that interpret a select historical period of time or event, and articles that review previous findings. The book Love and Hate in Jamestown, John Smith, Pocahontas, and the Start of a New Nation by David A. Price is an example of a secondary source. It was written after the founding and settling of Jamestown took place and is this author's interpretation of that time period. The recreation of the original Jamestown settlement in present-day Virginia is an example of a secondary source because it is a reenactment, and these structures and reenactors were not really present at the founding of the original Jamestown settlement. Can you tell the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? Let's test your knowledge.
To get by ship from England to Jamestown in 1607, you have to traverse more than 3,000 miles of the worst ocean in the world, the North Atlantic, in a really small wooden vessel, terribly cramped, terribly crowded, eating salt or spoiled food, drinking water with creatures in it. And what's even more remarkable is at the end of the journey, you're going to find yourself in an unknown territory, stretching unknown distances in every direction except the ocean. And there's the ocean between you and home. It's an extraordinary risk to just make the leap into the unknown and plant yourself there.
Ultimately, the goal simply was survival. This was a wilderness, to put it mildly. The living conditions couldn't possibly have been worse. And there were Native Americans living here who appeared to be the enemy, and everybody was trying to kill each other. That colony barely survived.
When the first settlers reached the shores of North America, in Virginia, in Massachusetts, the thing that struck them was the effectively unlimited extent of natural resources. They knew that the forests went back as far as anyone had ever been. They knew that there were fish in the rivers. They knew that there was enough land for generation after generation after generation of farmers. The mindset changed on the moment that the English colonists landed in America. Until then, natural resources were a restraint. Now, natural resources were a liberation.
The next thing you have to know about Jamestown is more people keep coming over. And the ones who come over later know something that the first ones didn't know, and that is that almost half of them are likely to die from local diseases. to which they are not acclimated, and from other things, their own bad food, their own bad sanitation, and ultimately hostility from the Indians, whom they've antagonized by their presence. And yet people do keep coming.
They were either fleeing religious persecution, they were fleeing poverty, they were fleeing a ceiling that said if you're not an aristocrat, you can't rise. And so there's a real sense of greater freedom here than anywhere else in the world. And a freedom that's not just political, but it's also a freedom to become somebody, a freedom to rise, a freedom to acquire property in a way that did not exist in the more structured and medieval societies around the world.
This document was written by King James I in 1606. It gives the Virginia Company land rights in the New World. Is this a primary source or a secondary source? This document is a primary source because it was written during the time period in which Jamestown was settled and by someone who was instrumental in the historical event, King James I. Our Strange New Land, Elizabeth's Jamestown Colony Diary, is a fictional tale written from the perspective of a young girl who lived in the first English colony in the New World, Jamestown. It was written by Patricia Herms. This is a secondary source because it is a historical fiction. This is the author Patricia Herms' interpretation of the colonization of Jamestown.